Welcome back again here. A very happy Friday to you. I'm still wearing my Packer shirt for your viewing pleasure. Actually, I'm recording both of these on Wednesday. Currently, at this moment, I'm looking at a college. Not this moment, the moment that Friday when you might be viewing. I've started that process with my daughter Abby. It's time to look at colleges. I've already practiced my line, which is, tell me about financial aid. And they'll say, we have this wonderful program. And I'll say, that's beautiful. So tell me about financial aid. But anyhow, I digress. So we're in chapter 5. And where we left off, Paul, just at the very beginning, was telling them that circumcision was of no value, that Old Testament covenant, that sign, you are God's people, that if you believe now that this is going to make you right with God, it's of no value. It's not to say that circumcision is this terrible thing. It's the value that you assign to it in your relationship with God. That's the problem here, okay? If you do something, and thus in verse 3, Galatians 5, verse 3, Paul said, I declare to you, if you let yourself be circumcised, you're obligated to keep the whole law. And then in verse 4, you who are trying to be justified, that is, declared righteous before God by the law, here's what has happened. You've been alienated from Christ and you've fallen away from grace. And what does he mean by that? Is that instead of grace being the free gift and relying on the free gift that is yours in Christ, you've fallen away because you're trying to do it, that is, make yourself right with God by the things you do. So we take a look here. Under that bullet point, very, very bottom of the page, I said, how are people going back to slavery? And well, circumcision was one of the things that Paul used here. Why was it considered slavery? Because if it's by the law, you're going to be under the penalty of the law, under its guilt, under its condemnation, under its control. You're in slavery. And thus, I put this down here, allowing yourself to be circumcised, and then I wrote A, B, and C. A, it effectively negates the value of Christ's sacrifice. I just found out that I spelled the word sacrifice wrong. I wrote sacrificey, which is not a word. Pardon my typo there. It effectively negates the value of Christ's sacrifice because what do you need Jesus for? I'm taking care of the issue myself to be right with God. It obligates a person to keep the whole law, okay? And C, it deprives a person of grace, and thus the person adopts a, quote, merit-based plan of salvation. Look at the good that I've done. Now, I put here just under that second bullet point, this is again under verses 1 through 7, it says, the life I live in the body, this is Galatians 2, 20 to 21, something we read earlier, remind you of this. Paul said, the life I live in the body, this right now, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, because if righteousness comes through the law, that is, by the things that I do, then Christ died for nothing. What's this whole thing with the cross? If you could take care of yourself, why would God send his one and only Son to suffer and die in the most brutal way in the world if you could just take care of it yourself? But we can't. Our sin had to be paid for. We broke the law, and thus there is a punishment for breaking the law. But the good news is that Jesus bore that for us in our place. It's the free gift of grace that is ours through faith. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Why did he do it? Because he loves us. Oh, grace. I don't set aside the grace of God. I don't say, nah, I don't need that. For if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. Okay, so I want to go back in history, then take us to present day. My third bullet point under this verses 1 through 7, I said, consider the time of the Reformation. And it really should have been verses 1 through 6. But I said, what sort of things did people believe would merit them favor with God? Well, at the time of Luther, there were all sorts of things going on. There are things like indulgences were sold. That was the big issue of the day. An indulgence was something you could purchase that the church would give you. You even get a signed paper here that would be the indulgence, that if you paid a certain amount, then the sins of your loved ones could be paid for, and they could be let out of a place called purgatory sooner, a place that's not scriptural, or even for yourself. You can pay in advance, if you will, pay it forward. All right, so what's the idea? If you give and do these things, then God will then show you favor, and you'll be released. Purgatory, by the way, is a place of suffering, supposedly, where your sins, the ones that Jesus didn't pay for, which is problematic, are purged. Purgatory, they're purged away. It's a place of unhappiness and suffering. But most importantly, purgatory doesn't jive with grace. Jesus didn't pay for everything. The rest of them, you got to have them purged away. But here's the thing. The indulgence, something you pay for to then get God to do what you would hope he would do for you. You're in control of the situation. You do it. The more you purchase, the more time out of suffering you get. People would do things, and Luther did this. You would go to Rome, make a pilgrimage there, and there'd be all these things called relics that are there. And you would merit then favor with God by going to see these things, like nails that were supposedly from the cross of Jesus himself. They'd have on display, and you'd wait in line, and of course you'd pay to be then in the presence of these relics. Or I think they had bones from John the Baptist, and these various things that, again, holy items. But what's the whole point? You would go and see them, be in their presence, and thus God would favor you for being there. Once again, we're at merit-based things, and this was where Luther was like, no. Grace. Free gift of grace. Jesus did it all. You don't need those things. Those things you're going to be enslaved, and you end up weighing these things. I did bad, I know that, so I hope my good made up for it, and you're hoping the scale tips in your favor. But you're always wondering, does it? But when you look at Jesus, it's all taken care of. We have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. It's all Jesus. And then, of course, I put down here, that's Reformation time. What about today? Are there things that creep into our heart and mind? Well, I went to church this Sunday. I'm right with God. Well, it's not the act of going to church as much as I want you to go to church that makes you right with God. It's by grace through faith. And if you go to church, yes, it is true that you should, quote, I'm quoting scripture here, grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. That is the depth of his love for us, and our trust in him can grow as he comes to us by his means. But if you say, I'm right with God because I went to church, well, now we have a problem, because then it's back to what I have done. I've been confirmed. Oh, is that how it works? Okay. Since I've been confirmed, I suffered with pastor for 2 to 3 years in class. That has to merit something with God. Now I'm good with him. Well, now something's gone wrong again. Because once again, now we're putting it on our merit. Confirmation class is great. It's a blessing, but when you make it into a merit-based time of learning and growth, then something's gone wrong in the learning and growth. Prayer. I pray, and I have that so often. Someone's really in a bad place in life, and I ask them where they are with God, and they say, I pray. like that merits something with God. And I always want to say you should be in the Word and listen. And sometimes I actually do that, and we actually then start doing that together. These things that we do so often, and they can even be good things, but if we assign then to them a merit with God, something has gone wrong, and we actually put ourselves under the yoke of slavery. Now I'm under the law again. Look at what I have done. I am good. So again, it's not to say that going to church is bad. It's not to say that confirmation is bad. It's not to say that praying is bad. But when we assign a value to our relationship with God because we have done those things, then something's gone terribly wrong. Terribly wrong. Or even, I mentioned indulgences. I gave a lot to the church. One of my just fictitious illustrations, a man who's been terrible his whole life comes to believe in God at the end of his life and says, I want to make up for the things that I've done, and so I'm giving $1 million to the church so that I am right with God and I've made up for the things that I've done. Can a church accept that $1 million? And I would tell you the answer is no. If it is given with the man specifically stating, I'm giving this to make up for the things that I have done, well, then we've given that man false hope on the greatest thing that we've been given, which is the gospel. We've been given the gospel. And he'd be giving out of law and slavery under that yoke. I have to do this. And we'd have the joy of saying, no, you keep this. You keep this. And I know there's some people saying, well, maybe if we preach the gospel and then have them give the money. Well, okay, all right, you're taking my illustration too far. But you get the point. If we truly are people of the gospel, we cannot accept that. Even what we give, and this always becomes a sticky issue at church sometimes. Do you give an offering out of guilt or duty? This is what we have to do. Or do we give simply out of a joyous response because of what Jesus has already done for us? That I don't have to give a dime. And if I don't give a dime, that Jesus is going to love me and I'm going to be loved by God no matter what I give, because it's not, God's love is not based on what I do, but out of joy and out of thanksgiving for what he has done for us. Now I can look at giving from a place of freedom, not because I have to, but just out of joy. And I want to make sure this message goes forth, and I want other people to have that same joy that I'm finding in the gospel. And that's something that a lot of places get wrong, especially when it comes to giving. Do we give because of the law, or do we give because of the gospel? Now I'm going to tell you this. Having a guilt trip, very effective. It can be very effective guilting people into giving. But if we do that, it means the ministry is wrong. It means that everything we believe has been distorted and twisted. It all has to come from the gospel and flow from the gospel. Okay, let's see here. Let's go over to verse 7 through 12. Paul says to the Galatians, you are running a good race. Who cut in on you? You think about people running a race, someone cutting in, to keep you from obeying the truth. That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. And then he uses a little yeast, works through the whole batch of dough. That's where that verse is there. It's just this law is working its way through. I'm confident that the Lord will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion, whoever that may be, will have to pay a penalty. All right, God is watching. Brothers and sisters, if I'm still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In other words, then I'd be going along with the crowd. In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. Now, this is just fascinating. The offense of the cross. The offense of the cross is the cross says you can't do it. that God's done it for you, but to many that's offensive. Are you telling me I can't do it? Are you telling me I can't do it? And God says, yeah. And there's an offense in the cross in that regard. And then finally, we're going to end with this. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. Verse 12, Paul says, as for those agitators, I wish they would go all the way and emasculate themselves. And there it is. And you see there's a crude logic in all of this. If you are saved by circumcision, okay, which, pardon me, is a relatively small cut, Paul's saying, well, you know, if you're right with God by doing that little act, why don't you just go all the way? I wish they'd go all the way and emasculate themselves. Well, you see there's, again, a crude logic here. So if you're right with God, because let's say you prayed 1 hour a day, and you're making then your act meritorious with God, well, then why don't you make yourself really right with God and pray for 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day? Then you'll really be right with God. And here you have an illustration I'm telling you everyone should get, but I would tell you, men, if you ever believe that we are saved by what we do, read Galatians 5, verses 7 through 12. As for those agitators, I wish they would go all the way and emasculate themselves. And there's an exclamation point here. And I tell you what, we're going to stop right here. And when we come back, what we are going to do is we're going to talk then about using freedom in a responsible manner. And I have more quotes from, or another quote from a founding father of our, well, I guess this is the first time I've used this, John Adams. And maybe I'll just give you this quote as a teaser here. The question is, if you're free from the law, does that mean you get to do whatever you want? All right. And I'm just going to give you what John Adams wrote, and then I will come to a stop. John said, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. In other words, if we don't have morality and religion, we're screwed. Our Constitution was made only for a religious and moral people. It is wholly inadequate for a government of any other. And it would say, if you've been given freedom and liberty, but we have people who then say, hey, we get to do whatever we want, is freedom and liberty really freedom and liberty? And will this even work? And when we come back, we're going to talk about that and then our life in Christ before Him and how do we use or don't use our freedom. With that thought, God's blessings on your weekend. Oh, there's one last thing. I'm on vacation. I'll be around, but I'm on vacation next week, so we do have to take a 1-week break. So if you know people who are behind in their Bible study, they got a week to catch up. But I will be back to finish off here Galatians 5 and 6. So there's a 1-week break, and then I'll be back. God's peace and blessings be yours.